Nobody plans to save a farm with a horse. Nobody wanted. Nobody wakes up on a Tuesday and thinks today is the day everything changes because of a skinny, dirty, half-blind animal that costs less than a used truck tire. But that is exactly what happened to the Calloway family in the hill country of Tennessee. And the people who heard the story the first time did not believe a single word of it. Then they saw the horse. Then they understood. The morning of October 14th started the same way every hard morning starts for people who work the land. Martin Calloway was up before the sun, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before he ever took the second sip. He was 53 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands that told the story of 30 years of farm work better than any biography could. He had inherited the Calloway farm from his father, who had inherited it from his father before that, and the weight of that history sat on him every single day like something physical. The farm was 214 acres in Hardin County, Tennessee. It had timber on the north end, a creek that ran clean through the middle of the property, and fields that had once grown enough to make the Calloways a name people respected in that county. That was before the drought years. That was before the equipment loans that stacked up like bad weather. That was before Martin's oldest son left for college and never came back to farm, and his daughter moved to Nashville, and his wife Carol started working double shifts at the clinic in town just to keep the health insurance active. By October of that year, Martin owed the bank $112,000. He had tried everything a man in his position could try. He had sold off the timber rights on the north acreage. He had leased the creekside pasture to a neighbor for cattle grazing. He had applied for 2 different government agricultural assistance programs and been denied for both. The farm was bleeding money, and Martin was running out of places to apply pressure. His neighbor, a man named Dale Pruitt, who ran a small boarding operation for horses about 6 miles down the road, had been pushing Martin for 2 seasons to get into equine therapy. Dale had seen farms turn themselves around with it. He had read articles, printed them out, and handed them to Martin across the fence line like a man delivering scripture. The idea was simple enough on the surface. People paid good money to spend time with horses. Disabled children, veterans with PTSD, adults in recovery from addiction, people dealing with anxiety and depression. The programs were real, the demand was growing, and the grant funding available for that kind of operation was substantial if you qualified. Martin had listened. Martin had nodded. Martin had taken the printed articles home and left them on the kitchen table where Carol read them and cried quietly because the idea was beautiful and the timing was impossible. To start an equine therapy program, you needed the right kind of horses. Calm animals. Trained animals. Animals with what the professionals called a therapeutic temperament. Those horses cost money. They cost a lot of money. And then Dale Pruitt called on the night of October 13th and told Martin about the auction. There was a dispersal sale happening the next morning at a livestock facility about 40 miles east. A large training operation had gone under, and they were liquidating everything. Horses, tack, equipment, fencing materials. Dale was going, and he thought Martin ought to come along, just to look, just to get a feel for prices. Maybe something would come available that fit the budget. Martin went. He told Carol he was just going to look. The auction facility smelled like it always smelled, which was hay and animal, and something underneath that, something older and wilder that no amount of cleaning ever fully removed. There were maybe 200 people there that morning, dealers and private buyers and people who bred performance horses and people who just liked the atmosphere. Martin walked the stalls before the sales started, the way any serious buyer does, looking at the animals, watching how they moved, checking their eyes and their legs. Most of the horses were beyond what he could afford. Quarter horses with show records and training papers. Warm bloods that had been used in jumping programs. A few older thoroughbreds that had washed out of racing, but still carried themselves like royalty. Beautiful animals, every one of them. and every one of them priced at 4 to 6 times what Martin had in his savings account. He and Dale stood at the back of the crowd and watched the early lots move through. Bids went fast. Numbers climbed quick. Martin drank bad coffee from a paper cup and kept his hands in his pockets and watched other people spend money he did not have. And then lot 47 came through the gate. The horse was a dark bay gelding, maybe 15 hands, with a rough coat that had not been properly groomed in what looked like weeks. He moved stiffly. His left eye had a visible opacity to it, a cloudiness that suggested partial blindness in that eye. The auctioneer described him in the flattest possible language. 12 years old, no papers, no training record on file. Sound enough for light work, the auctioneer said, but the hesitation in his voice told a different story. The horse stood in the ring and did not perform. He did not trot up clean. He did not show himself off. He just stood there looking at the crowd with his one good eye, like he already knew what they were going to say about him. The bidding opened at $800 and stalled almost immediately. Dale leaned over to Martin and said something that Martin would replay in his mind for months afterward. He said, "That horse looks like trouble dressed up in a winter coat." Martin did not respond. He was watching the horse. Not the way you watch an animal you are evaluating for purchase. The way you watch something when it reminds you of a feeling you recognize. The horse was not panicking in the ring. He was not aggressive. He was not throwing his head or dancing sideways or doing any of the things a difficult horse does when it is scared. He was just standing there, very still, in the middle of all that noise and chaos and human energy, and he looked completely unbothered by it. Martin raised his hand. He got the horse for $950. Dale looked at him like he had lost his mind. Martin was not entirely sure he had not. The horse loaded onto the trailer without any drama. He walked straight in, stood quietly, and waited. Martin drove home in silence, while Dale rode along, and did not say anything either, which was worse than if he had said something. Carol was standing on the porch when they pulled in. She looked at the trailer. She looked at Martin. She said, "What did you do?" Martin opened the trailer, and the horse walked out onto Calloway ground for the first time. He stood in the late afternoon light with his rough coat and his cloudy eye and his complete lack of any impressive quality, and he looked around at the hills and the creek and the old barn like he was taking inventory. Martin said, "I don't know yet." That was the truth. He genuinely did not know. He had spent $950 he could not spare on a horse nobody else had wanted, and he was standing in the driveway of a farm that was 11 months from foreclosure, and the only thing he had to go on was a feeling he could not explain to his wife or his neighbor or himself. The horse turned his head and looked at Martin with his one clear eye. Martin named him River, and that was the beginning. Word travels fast in small counties. By the end of that first week, most of the people Martin Calloway knew had already heard about the horse. Some of them heard it from Dale Pruitt, who was not a mean man, but was not a quiet one either. Some of them heard it from the guys at the feed store in town, where Martin went on Saturday morning to buy a bag of senior feed for River, because the horse was clearly underweight and needed calories before anything else. The story that circulated was the same basic story no matter who was telling it. Martin Calloway, who already owed more money than the farm was currently worth, had gone to a livestock auction and paid nearly $1,000 for a lame, half-blind, untrained gelding that not a single professional buyer had wanted. Nobody said it was a smart decision. Not one person. Carol did not say it was a smart decision either, but she also did not say the other thing, the thing that would have been easy and understandable to say. She did not tell Martin to sell the horse. She watched her husband lead River around the small paddock near the barn that first week, just walking, letting the horse get used to the land and the smells and the sounds. She watched the way Martin handled himself around River, quiet and deliberate, not rushing anything, and she recognized something in it even if she could not name it immediately. River was not what people expected when they finally came to see him. Neighbors who drove by slowed down at the fence. A couple of them stopped and got out and leaned on the rail and looked at the horse and then looked at Martin and did not say anything kind. He was not a beautiful animal by any standard measure. His winter coat came in patchy and dull. The cloudiness in his left eye gave him an unsettling look from certain angles, like he was staring through you rather than at you. He had a scar along his right shoulder from something that had happened before Martin ever knew him, and he moved slowly. Not lame exactly, but cautious, like an animal that had learned to check the ground before trusting it. But something had shifted, something that Martin could not have described to anyone who had not been sitting at that table or standing at that paddock fence, something that lived in the space between desperation and possibility, which is where most real things begin. River ate his senior feed and stood in his paddock and waited for what came next. He was very good at waiting. November came in cold that year, the kind of cold that gets into old barns and old bones equally, that makes every morning feel like an argument with the world. Martin Calloway started most of those mornings at River's stall before anything else. Before breakfast, before the day's work list, before the stack of bills on the kitchen counter that he had stopped opening because the numbers inside them had stopped telling him anything new. He had been doing research. Late nights at the kitchen table with Carol's old laptop, reading everything he could find about equine-assisted therapy, equine-assisted learning, the difference between the two, the certification bodies involved, the grant programs that existed at the state and federal and private foundation level. He filled a notebook with handwritten notes, the way he used to fill notebooks back in agricultural college, which felt like a different man's life now. Susan Gard had emailed him a list of resources, and he worked through every one of them. He called 2 farms in neighboring states that were running similar programs and asked them questions for an hour each, and both of them told him the same thing. Start the relationship with the certifying organization early. The process takes longer than you expect, and do not underestimate how much the horse matters. He was not underestimating the horse. What Martin did not tell Carol, and what he carried alone through those November weeks, was how close the actual edge was. He had received a letter from the bank in late October that was not technically a foreclosure notice, but was the letter that comes before the letter that is. It outlined a timeline. It used words like acceleration clause and loan maturity, and it was written in the careful language of institutions that have learned to say terrible things in the gentlest possible way. Martin had read it twice, folded it, and put it in the drawer in the barn where he kept veterinary records and old tax documents. He did not want it in the house. He had until early spring to show meaningful progress, or the bank would begin proceedings. That was the reality underneath everything else. All the research and the notebooks and the phone calls and the hope that had walked into the kitchen with Susan Gard that afternoon were happening inside a window that was not very wide. Martin was not a man who talked about fear easily. He had been raised by a father who treated worry as a kind of weakness, which was not the right lesson, but it was the one he had received, and he had never fully unlearned it. So he got up early and did the work and kept the research going and took care of River and did not say the word foreclosure out loud to the woman who shared his bed and who was already working 60 hours a week at the clinic to keep the family above water. Carol knew anyway. She had always been better at reading the house than Martin was. She knew the way you know things in a long marriage, through the quality of silences, and the specific way a man holds his coffee cup when something is eating at him. She did not press. She waited. She had her own relationship with River developing quietly, separate from Martin's. She went out to the paddock in the evening sometimes, after her clinic shifts, still in her scrubs, and she would lean against the fence rail, and River would come to her, and she would stand there in the cold and talk to the horse in a low voice about things she would not have said to another person. River listened the way he always listened, with that complete and unhurried attention his one clear eye on her face. The crisis inside the crisis came on a Thursday in the second week of November. Martin had been in contact with a woman named Dr. Patricia Holloway, who ran the regional certification program for equine-assisted therapy practitioners through a university extension office about 3 hours away. She had been encouraging in their email exchanges, had confirmed that a farm like the Calloway property could qualify as a host site, and had told Martin that the next certification cohort was beginning in January. The cost of the full certification program for one practitioner was $4,200. The cost for the host site evaluation and approval process was an additional $1,800. The total amount Martin needed to have in hand before January 15th was $6,000. She explained what she meant in practical terms. River's response to a stranger was not accidental, and it was not random. It was the response of a horse that had spent significant time in proximity to humans in emotional distress and had developed what she called a mirror response. He matched the emotional energy of the person in front of him. He read people the way working dogs read their handlers, through breath and body, and the subtle physiological signals that most animals notice and most humans have forgotten they send. She did not know his history. She could not explain where this ability had come from or how it had developed. But she was certain she was looking at it. She sat with Martin and Carol at the kitchen table that afternoon, and she talked for 2 hours. She talked about the therapy programs she ran and the results she had seen. She talked about the grant landscape for farms willing to host this kind of work. She talked about what certification required and how long it typically took and what the income model looked like once a program was established. She talked about a 14-year-old boy she had worked with the previous spring, a kid who had not spoken to an adult voluntarily in 3 years following a trauma, who had walked up to a horse in a round pen and put his forehead against the animal's neck and cried for 40 minutes and then turned around and asked Susan what the horse's name was. She said it was the first voluntary sentence he had produced in 36 months. Carol had her hand over her mouth by the time Susan finished talking. Martin was staring at the table. Susan looked at both of them and said, "I don't know if your farm is the right fit for this kind of program. There is a lot of work involved, and it takes time to build. But I will tell you what I told the other farms I have consulted with. The right horse changes everything. You either have the right horse or you don't." She paused. "You have the right horse." She left before dinner. Martin and Carol sat in the kitchen after she drove away, and the house was very quiet. Outside through the window, they could see the paddock where River stood in the last of the evening light, absolutely still, looking out at the fields like he had been waiting here all along. Martin said, $950. Carol laughed. It was the first real laugh Martin had heard from her in months. It started small, and then it got bigger, and then she was wiping her eyes and shaking her head and laughing, and Martin was laughing too. Not because anything was certain or solved or easy, but because sometimes a thing happens that is so unexpected and so strange that the only honest response is laughter. The farm was still in trouble. The debt had not moved. The bank did not care about a horse. But something had shifted. Something that Martin could not have described to anyone who had not been sitting at that table or standing at that paddock fence. Something that lived in the space between desperation and possibility, which is where most real things begin. River ate his senior feed and stood in his paddock and waited for what came next. He was very good at waiting. November came in cold that year. The kind of cold that gets into old barns and old bones equally, that makes every morning feel like an argument with the world. Martin Calloway started most of those mornings at River's stall before anything else. Before breakfast, before the day's work list, before the stack of bills on the kitchen counter that he had stopped opening because the numbers inside them had stopped telling him anything new. He had been doing research. Late nights at the kitchen table with Carol's old laptop, reading everything he could find about equine-assisted therapy, equine-assisted learning, the difference between the two. The certification bodies involved, the grant programs that existed at the state and federal and private foundation level. He filled a notebook with handwritten notes, the way he used to fill notebooks back in agricultural college, which felt like a different man's life now. Susan Gard had emailed him a list of resources, and he worked through every one of them. He called 2 farms in neighboring states that were running similar programs and asked them questions for an hour each, and both of them told him the same thing. Start the relationship with the certifying organization early. The process takes longer than you expect, and do not underestimate how much the horse matters. He was not underestimating the horse. What Martin did not tell Carol, and what he carried alone through those November weeks, was how close the actual edge was. He had received a letter from the bank in late October that was not technically a foreclosure notice, but was the letter that comes before the letter that is. It outlined a timeline. It used words like acceleration clause and loan maturity, and it was written in the careful language of institutions that have learned to say terrible things in the gentlest possible way. Martin had read it twice, folded it, and put it in the drawer in the barn where he kept veterinary records and old tax documents. He did not want it in the house. He had until early spring to show meaningful progress, where the bank would begin proceedings. That was the reality underneath everything else. All the research and the notebooks and the phone calls and the hope that had walked into the kitchen with Susan Gard that afternoon were happening inside a window that was not very wide. Martin was not a man who talked about fear easily. He had been raised by a father who treated worry as a kind of weakness, which was not the right lesson, but it was the one he had received, and he had never fully unlearned it. So he got up early and did the work and kept the research going and took care of River and did not say the word foreclosure out loud to the woman who shared his bed and who was already working 60 hours a week at the clinic to keep the family above water. Carol knew anyway. She had always been better at reading the house than Martin was. She knew the way you know things in a long marriage, through the quality of silences, and the specific way a man holds his coffee cup when something is eating at him. She did not press. She waited. She had her own relationship with River developing quietly, separate from Martin's. She went out to the paddock in the evening sometimes, after her clinic shifts, still in her scrubs, and she would lean against the fence rail, and River would come to her, and she would stand there in the cold and talk to the horse in a low voice about things she would not have said to another person. River listened the way he always listened, with that complete and unhurried attention, his one clear eye on her face. The crisis inside the crisis came on a Thursday in the second week of November. Martin had been in contact with a woman named Dr. Patricia Holloway, who ran the regional certification program for equine-assisted therapy practitioners through a university extension office about 3 hours away. She had been encouraging in their email exchanges, had confirmed that a farm like the Calloway property could qualify as a host site, and had told Martin that the next certification cohort was beginning in January. The cost of the full certification program for one practitioner was $4,200. The cost for the host site evaluation and approval process was an additional $1,800. The total amount Martin needed to have in hand before January 15th was $6,000.
Easy now, boy.
Martin sat with that number for a full day. He went through every account, every option, every asset that could conceivably be converted to cash in the time available. He could get approximately $2,000 from the savings account without leaving the farm operationally unable to function. He had a small life insurance policy that had a cash value component that could be borrowed against, which would give him another $800. He had a set of antique farm equipment that a collector had expressed interest in 2 years back, a man whose number he still had in his phone. If that man was still interested, and if the number was still good, and if the timing worked, he might get another $1,000. That left him short by over $2,000. He drove to town and sat in the parking lot of the bank for 30 minutes without going inside. He was not sure what he would say if he went in. The bank had already made its position clear. He was not a customer in good standing. He was a risk assessment on a spreadsheet. He drove home without going in. Dale Pruitt found out about the shortfall, the way Dale Pruitt found out about most things, which was through his wife, who had talked to Carol, who had not said anything directly, but had said enough. Dale showed up at the farm on a Saturday morning with a casserole from his wife, and the directness of a man who grew up in a place where people handled things face to face. He sat down at Martin's table and asked straight out what the number was. Martin told him. Dale nodded and drank his coffee and was quiet for a minute. Then Dale said he wanted to make a proposal. He said that he had been thinking about the equine therapy idea since the day he brought Susan to the farm, and that he believed in it enough to put money behind it. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a man without debt and with a small amount of savings that he had been holding for an opportunity worth backing. He said he would provide $2,000 as an investment, not a loan, in exchange for a small percentage of any future revenue the program generated. He said he had talked to his wife about it, and she was in agreement. Martin looked at Dale for a long time, and then he looked at the table, and he did not say anything for a moment, because there was too much in the way of the words. Then he said, "You don't have to do that." Dale said, "I know I don't have to. That is why it means something." The paperwork they drew up between them was simple, written by hand and witnessed by Carol. The kind of agreement that works, because the people involved in it are the kind of people whose word means what their word has always meant. $2,000 in exchange for 8% of net program revenue for a period of 5 years. Martin deposited the money on Monday. He called Dr. Holloway that afternoon and told her the Calloway farm was registering for the January cohort. He mailed the check before he could change his mind. He went out to River's paddock that evening as the light went flat and gray and the temperature dropped toward freezing. The horse came to him at the fence, and Martin stood there with his hand on River's neck, that rough coat finally filling in a little now that the horse had been eating properly for 6 weeks. And he breathed in the cold air and the smell of the horse, and he felt something that he could not have named cleanly, but that lived somewhere in the neighborhood of gratitude. He had $6,000 committed. He had a bank letter in the barn drawer. He had a certification start date in January, and a horse that a professional had looked at and called a gift. He also had no guarantee that any of it would work. That was the honest truth of where he stood. The gap between where Martin Calloway was and where he needed to be was still enormous, and the path across it was uncertain and steep. But for the first time in longer than he wanted to count, he could see the other side. River pressed his head forward into Martin's chest. That low, settling gesture, the one that meant something specific in the language of this particular animal. Martin stayed until it was full dark. He could afford to take 10 more minutes. The work would be there in the morning. It was always there in the morning. But this exact moment in the cold, with the horse and the dark coming on and the farm all around him, this was worth standing still for. January arrived the way it always does in Tennessee Hill country, with a gray sky that sat low and heavy over the fields and a cold that had opinions about everything. Martin Calloway drove the 3 hours to the University Extension campus on the first day of the certification cohort with a thermos of coffee and a notebook and the particular kind of focus that comes from having no margin for failure. He was the oldest person in the room by about 15 years. The other participants were mostly younger practitioners, people who already worked in social work or counseling or occupational therapy and were adding equine methods to an existing practice. Martin was a farmer who had done 30 years of work with animals and 0 formal hours in therapeutic practice. He sat in the back row and took notes on everything. Dr. Patricia Holloway ran the program with the precision of someone who had spent decades separating what worked from what did not. She was in her early 60s, small, with the kind of direct eye contact that made you feel she was reading more than your face. On the first morning, she had every participant introduce themselves and explain what brought them to the room. When it was Martin's turn, he told the truth, which was that he had a farm in debt, and a horse he had bought by accident, and a bank letter sitting in a drawer that had a deadline attached to it. He said he was not a therapist, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He said he believed in what the program could do because of what he had already seen River do in 6 weeks on his property, and he was there to learn everything he needed to know to build something real before time ran out. The room was quiet for a second after he finished. Then Dr. Holloway said, "Good. Honest is what we work with here." She told him after class on that first day that she had received a call about River from Susan Gard. Susan had described the horse in specific clinical language that Martin had not understood at the time, but was beginning to understand now. She said that horses with River's type of sensitivity and responsiveness were rare, and that most programs spent years searching for one animal of that quality. She said the fact that Martin had found him at a dispersal auction for under $1,000 was either extraordinary luck or something that she personally believed in, but could not put in any official course material. Martin drove home that Friday evening through cold, dark roads, and he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt like he was in the right fight. Not a winnable fight necessarily, not yet, but the right one. The kind of fight where even losing has dignity to it. The certification ran over 8 weekends across January, February, and into March, alternating classroom work with practical sessions at the university's demonstration facility. Martin attended every session. He drove 6 hours round trip 16 times without missing a single day. He read every assigned text, some of them twice. He wrote papers on facilitation ethics and trauma-informed practice and the neuroscience of human-animal interaction that Carol proofread at the kitchen table after her night shifts, correcting his grammar and asking questions that made him explain concepts more clearly, which helped him understand them better himself. Meanwhile, River continued his quiet work at the Calloway farm, though the clients were not official yet. It started with a boy from down the road, the 14-year-old son of a family that Carol knew through the clinic. The boy's name was Jesse, and he had been through something that his family did not discuss in detail, but that had left visible marks. He was withdrawn in the way that goes past shy and into somewhere lonelier. His mother had called Carl in late January and asked, cautiously, if it would be all right if Jesse came out to see the horse. Not for any program, just to be around an animal. Carol said yes. Jesse came on a Saturday afternoon and stood at the paddock fence for 20 minutes without going in. Martin did not push him. He stood nearby doing fence work, giving the boy space to take his time. River stood about 30 feet from the fence and watched Jesse with that one clear eye and did not come closer. Then something shifted. Martin could not have said exactly what changed, only that something in Jesse's posture changed, some small release, and River walked forward in that slow, careful way of his and came to the fence and put his face near Jesse's hands. Jesse stood very still. Then he lifted one hand and put it against River's nose very gently, the way you touch something you are not sure is real. He came back the next Saturday, and the one after that. Martin did not facilitate these visits as any kind of formal session. He was not certified yet, and he was careful about that. But he watched what happened between the boy and the horse over those winter Saturdays, and he understood it in a way that went beyond what the coursework was teaching him. River did not perform for Jesse. He did not do tricks or show anything impressive. He was simply fully present with the boy, matching his energy, following the conversation that was happening beneath any spoken language. By the 5th visit, Jesse was talking while he stood at River's side. Not to Martin, not to anyone in particular, just talking, telling River things. The horse listened with his head low and his ears soft and his whole body absolutely still. Jesse's mother called Carol in March and was crying when she called. She said something had changed in her son. She could not explain what exactly, only that it was real, and it had started around the time he began visiting the horse. Martin received his certification on the 14th of March, a Friday, the same week the Tennessee Hills began their first tentative move toward spring. He drove home with the paper on the passenger seat and pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for a minute before going inside. The bank letter had been joined in the barn drawer by a second letter, this one from a state agricultural development office, acknowledging receipt of his grant application for the Farm Diversification Program. Susan Gard had helped him put that application together over 3 sessions at her facility, and she had been careful and thorough in a way that gave Martin confidence in it without giving him certainty. Grant applications were grant applications. The answer could be no. But the application was in, and it was strong, and that was what was possible to control. He had also received inquiries. Word had spread through Carol's clinic network about the Calloway farm and the horse. A social worker in the county seat had called asking about program availability for a group of adolescents she worked with. A veterans outreach coordinator had emailed asking about the farm's capacity and what populations they were set up to serve. A family with a daughter who had a complex disability had reached out through Susan's referral asking about individual sessions. Martin had told each of them the same thing. He was certified. The farm was not quite ready. Give him 60 days. He had 60 days. He had maybe a little more than 60 days given the bank's timeline and the grant timeline and the rate at which the farm's operational costs were eating what remained in the account. He had a certified partner in Susan Gard who had agreed to co-facilitate the first sessions and mentor him through the early months. He had Dale Pruitt's $2,000, mostly spent now on the certification, and the first round of facility improvements to the therapy paddock. He had a wife who had not slept enough in 6 months and who had not complained once. And he had River. River was 15 hands of unremarkable-looking bay, gelding with a cloudy eye and a scar on his shoulder, and a coat that would never be the glossy kind that turns heads at shows. He was not the horse anyone would have chosen for any purpose. He had not been chosen. He had been bought by accident by a man who went to an auction just to look and came home with something he could not explain. But the boy named Jesse was talking again, and the farm was still standing. And in 60 days something was either going to be there or it was not going to be there, and there was no more waiting to be done. Martin walked out to the paddock in the last of the March light. River came to him at the fence with that same steady, unhurried walk he always used, and Martin put both hands on the horse's face and looked at him directly, right into that one clear eye that saw everything. "We have to make this work," Martin said. River blinked slowly, the way horses do when they are comfortable and unafraid. Martin took that as an answer. The grant letter came on a Wednesday in early April, and it came while Martin Calloway was out in the south field, fixing a section of fence that had leaned hard against the winter. Carol called him on his cell phone from the house, and her voice told him everything before the words did. She said the amount 3 times. $47,200. Disbursed in 2 phases, the first within 30 days of acceptance, the second upon completion of a 6-month program review. She said it twice more, and then she stopped talking, and Martin could hear her breathing on the other end of the line in the April quiet of the house. Martin set down his fence pliers and stood in the field with the phone in his hand and the hills all around him, the same hills that had been in his family for 3 generations, and he was not ashamed of what happened in the next 2 minutes, which was that he sat down in the grass and put his face in his hands, not from sadness, from the specific and overwhelming release that comes when you have been holding something at the edge of breaking for so long that you have forgotten what it felt like not to hold it. It poured out of him in the field with nobody watching. All the months of it, the drawer in the barn, and the cold mornings, and the coffee gone cold, and the bills he had stopped opening, and the nights he had lain in the dark next to Carol listening to her sleep, and running numbers in his head that never added up. He got up. He walked back to the barn. He washed his face with the cold water from the barn spigot, and then he went to River's paddock and stood at the fence and looked at the horse for a long time without saying anything. River walked over and put his head against Martin's chest. The first official therapy sessions at the Calloway farm began on the third Saturday of April. Susan Gard drove out and co-facilitated alongside Martin, and she brought with her the professional steadiness of someone who has done this work for years, who understands that the first sessions are always the most uncertain, and that the uncertainty is part of the work. The clients that first day were 3 veterans from a county outreach program, men in their 40s and 50s with the specific kind of closed-down quality that some men carry when they have seen things that do not fit inside ordinary language. Martin opened the gate and let them into the therapy paddock, and then he stepped back and he watched River do what River did. The horse moved among the 3 men with that careful, unhurried attention, reading each of them in turn, stopping longest with the one who stood farthest back, the one who had positioned himself at the edge of the group in the way people do when they have learned that distance is safer than proximity. River did not push him. He came close enough to be noticed, and then stood very still at an angle that was not direct, not confrontational, just present, available. The man kept his arms crossed and his face neutral for a long time. River did not move away. Then the man uncrossed his arms. Just that. It was a small thing. But Susan saw it, and Martin saw it, and they did not look at each other, because in this kind of work, you learn not to react to the moments that matter, because reacting changes them. By the end of the session, that man was standing next to River with one hand resting on the horse's neck. He had not said anything. He had not been asked to say anything. But something had moved in him that was visible to anyone who had eyes for it. After the veterans left that day, Susan sat in Martin's kitchen, and they debriefed the session with the thoroughness that the work required. She told Martin that he had done well, that his instincts for when to hold back and when to be present were sound, that River had done what she had known River would do, which was exactly the right thing at the right moment for each person in the paddock. She said she had been in this field for 8 years, and had worked with perhaps a dozen horses that had what River had, and that every single one of those horses had come to the work through an unlikely path. She said she believed that animals with this kind of ability were shaped by difficult histories, by having been through things that required them to develop extraordinary sensitivity in order to survive. She did not know what River's history had been before the Calloway farm, but she believed it had made him what he was. Martin poured her more coffee and thought about the auction, the $950, the horse standing alone in the ring with his cloudy eye and his rough coat, while the professional buyers looked elsewhere. He thought about the specific mercy of not knowing what you are doing at the moment when doing it is necessary. The program grew through spring and into summer. The social worker from the county seat brought her adolescent group on alternating Fridays. The family with a daughter who had complex disabilities came every other Saturday, and River met that young woman with the same steady gentleness he brought to everyone, and she laughed out loud the first time his whiskers touched her hand, a bright and uncomplicated laugh that made her mother cry and made Martin turn away toward the fence for a moment to collect himself. A local school counselor began referring students who were struggling in ways that traditional settings had not reached. A hospice organization called asking about the possibility of occasional visits for patients in early care stages. The Calloway farm was becoming something that Martin had not had a word for when he started, though the proper term was therapeutic equine partner facility. What it felt like from the inside was closer to a place where people came when they had run out of other places to go. The bank debt was restructured in June, made possible by the first grant disbursement and the documented program revenue that Martin brought to the meeting alongside paperwork that Dr. Holloway had helped him prepare. The loan officer who had written the soft language terrible letter in October sat across the table from Martin and looked at the numbers and the grant documentation and the program enrollment figures. and he said that the bank was pleased to see the farm moving in a positive direction. Martin thanked him and did not say the other things he thought. Dale Pruitt got his first revenue share payment in July. It was not a large check, but Martin drove it over personally and handed it to Dale in the driveway, and Dale looked at it and looked at Martin and said, "I want you to know I never expected to see this." Martin said, "I know. That is why I made sure you did." River turned 1 year on the Calloway farm that October. Martin did not know his actual birthday, but he had arrived in October, and that was close enough. He was heavier now, the senior feed and the regular care and the good water from the property creek, having put weight on the frame that had looked so poor at the auction. His coat was better. Not glossy, not showing perfect, but honest and full and the color of dark earth after rain. The scar on his shoulder was still there and would always be there. His left eye was still clouded, still seeing whatever partial version of the world that eye showed him. He moved the same way, careful and deliberate, checking the ground before trusting it. He was still not a beautiful horse by any standard measure anyone would use at a sale. He would not have drawn a different result at a different auction. The professional buyers who had passed over him in October of the previous year were not wrong by the only logic they were using. He had no papers, no training record, no obvious performance value. He was worth $950 to the market. To the Calloway farm he was worth every acre and every board and every post and every mile of fence and every generation of the family that had worked that land and the generations that might still work it if things continued to hold. He was worth everything, because without him there would not have been a lever long enough or strong enough to move the boulder that had been sitting on the Calloway family for 3 years of compounding difficulty. Martin stood at River's paddock fence on the October morning that marked the year. The same hills, the same creek sound, the same light that comes in the fall in that county, low and amber and honest. River came to him without being called, the way he always came. Martin thought about what he would tell his daughter in Nashville when she visited at Christmas, how he would explain the whole thing. He thought about how you compress a year like this into something that makes sense to a person who is not standing in the field, or sitting at the kitchen table, or driving through the cold dark to the certification program, or watching a veteran on Ross's arms beside a horse in a paddock on a spring morning. He thought maybe you could not compress it. Maybe some stories had to be told at full length, all of it, the auction and the drawer and the grant letter and the laugh of a young woman who had never touched a horse before and laughed like the world was a gift when River's whiskers touched her palm. Martin put his hand on River's neck, on the rough and honest coat of the horse nobody wanted. He said, "Good boy," and River stood still in the October light of a farm that was still standing, which was the whole point, which had always been the whole point, and which would not have been possible without the blunder that turned out to be the only right thing that happened that year. Some mistakes are not mistakes. Some things that look like nothing are everything. And sometimes the horse that nobody bids on is the one that saves the farm.